Toys are not limited to dolls or cars. They can take many shapes, and people often treat them in many ways. It was said that the gentle Andrew Gardner became a toy inside a house of horrors, used and manipulated by those who lived with him. Andrew was described as fragile, shy, quiet, and so harmless he would not hurt a fly. Because of these traits, he tended to seek approval and keep the peace. Life appeared manageable despite a few setbacks, until a woman entered his world and his path shifted for the worse. Viewers were encouraged to support the channel, liking the video, trying the new hype feature, leaving a comment, and subscribing were noted as small actions that make a big difference. Gratitude was expressed for any help given. Claire Nichols, born in 1,981 inches, Portsmouth on England's southern coast, entered the story next. Little was publicly recorded about her family. However, it has often been inferred that something harmful likely touched her early years and left deep scars. Given the acts later linked to her, it seems unlikely that a contented person would simply wake up and choose such a course. Doctors reportedly observed mild developmental delays in her childhood. At 15, Claire left home. Her parents were in the middle of a bitter divorce, and constant arguments filled the house. The departure was impulsive rather than planned. She did not go to relatives or a foster placement. She simply packed a bag and walked away from the place where she had grown up. The schoolgirl was suddenly on her own. Before long, she met a man named Malcolm and moved in with him. They stayed together for 2 years, until she turned 17. After the breakup, she drifted again, taking odd jobs and surviving week to week. By 18, the exhaustion of that unsettled life set in, and stability began to look necessary. Around then, she met John Peterson, also from Portsmouth. He had served as a radar operator in the Royal Navy. Yet one detail overshadowed the rest. John was 46, while Claire was only 18. She might have been legally an adult, but beside him she was still very young. The age gap was not the only concern. Reports indicated that John had a prior conviction related to an offense against a minor, a warning sign that would trouble many observers and cast a long shadow over the relationship. He did not hide his past. Even so, the relationship moved forward, and over the next few years they had 3 children together, 2 daughters and a son. At first glance, it might appear that a young woman fell into an older man's trap and became his victim. In practice, Peterson later said the opposite happened. He described Claire as controlling and quick to anger. Small irritations, he claimed, could trigger outbursts. Verbal taunts mixed with physical aggression, and manipulation became routine. In his words, she was a devil, the most malicious person he had ever known. While living with her, he felt watched and required to account for nearly every step. She kept a tight grip on daily life, and if anything seemed off to her, consequences followed. According to Peterson, those consequences often turned physical. Even a quick trip to the corner shop without her say-so could set her off. He recounted being punched, having objects hurled at him, and being called vile names when she believed he had ignored her rules. It became a pattern day after day. By 2003, John said he had reached his limit. His concern focused less on himself and more on the children. Though Claire's anger had not, by his account, targeted them yet, he felt certain that boundary would eventually be crossed. Fearing for their safety, he contacted social services and reported that the children's mother was abusive and manipulative. His warning, however, was dismissed. Officials cited his prior conviction involving a minor and treated his claims with skepticism. The response went further. Social services phoned Claire and warned that her children could be removed unless she ended the relationship with a convicted man. After that call, Claire packed up and left with the children. She was 21 then. She chose to move north to Newcastle, where her mother and sister were living, hoping proximity to family would provide support. In Newcastle, Claire began a new relationship with Stephen Martin, who was 37, about 16 years older than she was. The age gap was not the sole concern. Stephen had previously lived with Claire's mother for several years in what was described as a serious, long-term partnership. With Stephen, Claire reportedly continued a pattern of control. using intimacy as leverage. Because Stephen's cognitive abilities were said to be below average, he was especially vulnerable to such influence. The relationship lurched between breakups and reconciliations and lasted roughly 2 years before Stephen was no longer in the picture. Claire soon focused on someone new, Andrew Gardner, age 31. They met while attending a program for adults with special needs. Andrew had grown up in Hetton, in the Northeast with his parents, Ken and Jean, and 2 brothers. As a boy, he was affectionate and playful, fishing with his father, joking with his brothers, and spending most of his time within a close family circle. School, however, proved difficult for him, and learning came slowly from the start. Because of these challenges, he was moved to a specialized school, which he finished successfully. He later found steady work as a car park attendant. His extreme vulnerability and very low IQ left him open to influence, and people could steer him with little effort. That made him the kind of man Claire preferred. At 31, Andrew met Claire Nichols. He had previously dated her sister. So, the young woman who had once been involved with her mother's former partner now began seeing her sister's ex, a striking pattern. Andrew blended into the household and stepped into a father's role for Claire's 3 children. He bonded with them easily, and many described him as a genuinely good dad, taking the kids to the park, walking them to and from school, and keeping a gentle routine. Claire, meanwhile, presented as a devoted mother, and the family was often viewed as nearly ideal. Experience suggests, however, that flawless families are rare. Before long, once the doors were closed, the image started to crack, and the situation within the home began to unravel. As noted earlier, Claire craved control. In Andrew, she seemed to see someone who should obey, serve, and meet every demand. Affection did not appear to be part of her approach. Like many domineering partners, she justified her conduct with thin claims, labeling Andrew lazy, useless, and unworthy. If chores failed to meet her standards, money fell short, or he tried to assert himself, anger followed. Home life turned into a stream of insults that never seemed to stop. At first, the harm was verbal put-downs designed to humiliate him, break his confidence, and wear down his sense of self. It did not stay there for long. The taunts reportedly gave way to physical assaults. According to accounts, Claire struck Andrew for even minor departures from her rules, and she began to restrict his food. Bit by bit, the pattern hardened into routine, demands issued, compliance expected, and punishment delivered when she decided he had fallen short. Dinner became a performance of control. Claire and her 3 children sat at the table, while Andrew was made to sit on the floor and wait for leftovers. Many nights, no food arrived, only insults and claims that he was useless and a drain on the family's money. She urged the children to shout at him, and they copied her, believing this was normal. Hunger soon defined Andrew's days. He grew thin and began secretly taking small pieces of bread or bits of chocolate from the cupboards. When Claire noticed, she cut the pockets from his trousers so he could not hide food. She also began counting the biscuits and sweets in the pantry and weighing what remained in the fridge. Tracking every gram, her control reached beyond meals. It was suggested she took a kind of satisfaction in his misery, because starvation was paired with sleep deprivation. If he nodded off, she would wake him and order him to walk around the room, ensuring rest was denied along with dignity. Soon after, the familiar pattern of abuse appeared. Andrew was cut off from everyone. His phone was taken, and he was forbidden to contact relatives. He could not leave the house except to walk the children to school nearby and collect them at day's end. Highly vulnerable and unsure how to refuse demands, he was easy to steer. Through steady pressure, Claire pushed him to sever all ties, and for more than a year he spoke to no one in his family. In 2006, roughly a year into the relationship, a quiet act of defiance occurred. Andrew slipped away to see his family without Claire realizing it. When he arrived at his parents' door, shock met him. Months had passed with no word. The last time they had spoken, he had said he wanted nothing to do with them. Now, the person on the doorstep was only a trace of the gentle man they remembered. Pale, weakened, and visibly unwell, he stood there with tears in his eyes. When his shoes were removed, His mother noticed angry blisters across his feet. The sight confirmed what their fears had suggested. Isolation had not only broken his spirit, it had begun to wear down his body as well. He told his family he had washed his feet and tried to dry them by the fire, then drifted off and was burned. His parents, seeing his condition, urged him to leave her at once and promised to help him get out safely. Andrew declined. He did not want them pulled into conflict. He asked only for a little money and some food, then left quickly, afraid Claire would discover he had broken her rules. Soon after, he phoned his grandmother and left a brief message, asking her to thank his parents and to say he likely would not be able to visit again. The words turned out to be tragically accurate. His parents never saw him alive after that day in 2006. In the weeks and months that followed, his mother kept calling, but could not reach him. The family believed he remained in Newcastle. In reality, Claire had moved with Andrew and the children to Chilton in County Durham. A few years passed, bringing the story to 2008. Andrew Gardner had lived with Claire for 3 years, and the cruelty grew worse with time. The household, 3 children included, though it scarcely felt like a family relocated to No. 14 Arthur Street, in the small town of Chilton, about a half-hour south of Newcastle, where they had lived before. That address would later be remembered as Claire Nichols's House of Horrors. After the move, Andrew's situation deteriorated further because others joined the abuse. One was Simon Nichols, Claire's 2-year-old brother. Like many who knew her, he seemed frightened of Claire and did whatever she demanded. The other newcomer was Stephen Martin, Claire's former partner and her mother's ex-boyfriend. Together, these 2 housemates acted as Claire's accomplices and began mistreating Andrew alongside her. Around the same time, another major change arrived. Claire gave birth to a daughter with Andrew, a child he cherished. By then, after 3 years of mistreatment, he had lost interest in his own well-being, and the baby became the one reason he kept going. Thus, in 2008, 8 people were living under that roof. Claire, the driving force and chief instigator. Andrew, the main target of the abuse. Simon, the younger brother who followed Claire's lead. Stephen, the former boyfriend who also obeyed her, and 4 children. Within those walls, the balance of power was never in doubt, and Andrew's life, already fragile, slid deeper into fear, deprivation, and pain. The 3 older children were between 6 and 9, and Andrew's daughter was only a few months old. After Simon and Stephen moved in, the cruelty intensified. Stephen's presence was not incidental. His relationship with Claire resumed. They did not hide it. In fact, Claire made a point of it, insisting that another person's shame heightened her excitement. Control seemed to be what she valued most, and Andrew's suffering drew her focus. Andrew was forced to witness their intimacy. According to accounts, Claire was even more stimulated when pain was involved. Beatings, kicks, and scratches came first. Moments later, she and Stephen would turn to each other. Each episode pushed boundaries further, and the punishments grew more extreme. Claire continually devised new ways to hurt and degrade him, turning violent fantasies into routine acts. Simon and Stephen enabled her at every step, eager to keep her approval and follow her orders. Within that house, power flowed one way toward Claire, and the harm landed on Andrew. The pattern became clear. Humiliation was staged, violence was choreographed, and any trace of compassion was shut out. Andrew was flogged, long strands of curtain wire snapped across his bare skin, leaving jagged, open welts. A soaked kitchen towel, knotted at one end, was then swung into his ribs and back. Its weight landed with a thud, raising dark, spreading bruises. The assaults escalated to burns. A lighter was held to his flesh, and at other times a heater was turned to maximum before his hands were pressed against the scorching elements. On one occasion he was made to stand in an empty bathtub while a kettle was boiled. Scalding water was poured over his feet, and the pain was so fierce he could not stand or walk for a long while afterward. Branding became another fixation. Metal odds and ends, keys, nails, even ordinary forks were heated and raked across his skin. The house's residents treated his body like a canvas for cruelty. In one episode, they turned his back into a board for tic-tac-toe. A sharp tool scored a grid, and then, square by square, X's and O's were carved in turn. Each act seemed designed not only to injure, but to humiliate, as if suffering itself were the point. The cruelty was extreme, yet it seemed to entertain Claire, Simon, and Stephen. Andrew's wounds bled freely, and no one offered care. To keep blood off the sofa and carpet, Claire laid newspapers on the floor and ordered him to lie there. Her priority was control over the home, over Andrew, and even over her children. It began with instructions to the 3 older kids. Watch Andrew constantly, report every move, guard the kitchen so he could not take food, and stop him from going outside. The orders soon went further. The children were told to insult him and to repeat that he was worthless. They were also directed to attack him. When Andrew lay on the floor, they gathered around and kicked, hit, and even jumped on him as if he were a trampoline. He curled into a fetal position and did not resist, knowing their cruelty was being orchestrated by their mother. Once, early on, Andrew had tried to be a father figure to them. He cared for the children in the way he knew how, and attempted to be present in their daily lives. That made what followed even more devastating. Claire's influence was so pervasive that the children came to believe Andrew deserved what he got. In their eyes, his suffering had been normalized. Within that house, compassion was pushed aside, and obedience to Claire's rules took its place. The result was a scene where pain went unchecked, humiliation was routine, and a man who had once shown the children tenderness was reduced to a target of their learned cruelty. The ongoing abuse scarred not only Andrew, but also the children, who endured severe psychological harm from witnessing and participating in the violence. Many might wonder why a grown man stayed instead of simply walking away. The reasons were complex. From childhood, Andrew had been exceptionally vulnerable and easily controlled. His trusting nature made resistance almost impossible. More importantly, he now had a baby daughter with Claire. She lived in the same house, and Andrew could not bear the thought of abandoning her. Even with his limited understanding, he realized that any attempt to escape with his child would quickly be discovered. And so, the torment continued until March 2009. By then, Andrew's body had been pushed far beyond its limits. Constant hunger left him weighing only 57 kilograms at a height of 175 centimeters, a dangerous deficit for an adult man. Daily beatings and injuries covered his body in bruises, burns, and cuts. In total, he bore more than 100 wounds of varying severity. Years of starvation and abuse had also led to blood poisoning and lung disease. By the end, Andrew was so frail and weakened that even if he had wanted to flee, he no longer had the strength to reach the door. He no longer had the strength to run. Even so, Andrew held on. His infant daughter was his anchor, his whole world, and he lived for her, nursing a quiet hope that a way out might appear, that his abusers would eventually tire of harming him and life would steady. That hope never came. On the 13th of March 2009, Claire launched another assault. As before, the pretext was that Andrew was lazy, useless, and beneath her. She hurled slurs, shouting that she regretted ever meeting him. After the tirade, she slipped off her rings and struck him repeatedly. Stephen and Simon were present when the punches began, and before long they joined in. Andrew curled on the floor in a fetal huddle, trying to shield his head and chest. He clung to the thought that the blows might stop if he stayed small and still, but the attack only gathered force. One after another, they kicked and stamped on him, taking turns as if the beating were a task to be shared. In that cramped room, hope shrank to a whisper, and survival became the only thing left within reach. Claire reportedly slammed Andrew's head against the floor several times, then stood on his back and jumped, using her full weight. By then, he was barely responsive. The beating left him with multiple broken ribs that punctured his lungs and a brain hemorrhage, yet he was somehow still alive. Afterward, Claire and Stephen engaged in sex beside him, and then the household went about its routine, leaving Andrew where he lay. Over the next few hours, he endured unbearable pain and died. An autopsy later indicated he had remained conscious but was too injured to move. In effect, He suffocated because the fractured ribs pierced his lungs. Realizing the violence had gone beyond anything they could hide, Claire, Simon, and Stephen panicked. They had driven the cruelty to its limit and now faced a body and the certainty of consequences. In the end, those inside the so-called House of Horrors settled on a plan they believed might keep punishment at bay. They appeared to believe they would face no consequences. That same night, at 11:27 p.m., when Andrew died, Claire phoned emergency services, sounding distraught and claiming concern for her partner. She said he had been assaulted by unidentified attackers on his way home, robbed, and beaten so badly that he barely managed to return. When paramedics reached number 14 Arthur Street, there was nothing left to do. Andrew Gardner, 35, lay on the living room floor wearing only shorts. He was not breathing, had no pulse, and rigor had set in clear signs he had been dead for hours. The account of a street attack immediately raised doubts. One of the responders asked when Andrew had arrived home and how long he had been lying there. Claire responded that it had been about 30 minutes. Claire claimed Andrew told her that strangers had attacked, robbed, and beaten him. She said he then collapsed on the living room floor, unable to stand and struggling to breathe. She phoned emergency services, but she insisted help came too late. Simon Nichols told officers that Andrew left the house around 8:30 p.m. and returned after 11 p.m., saying he had been assaulted. Claire added that she was upstairs when he came in, while Stephen, Martin, and Simon were watching television. The doctor who examined Andrew's body saw through the story at once. Rigor and other signs indicated he had been dead for hours. The evidence suggested a slow, excruciating death rather than a recent street attack. Paramedics immediately alerted the police. Andrew's body was sent for autopsy, and Claire, Simon, and Stephen were taken in for questioning. All three tried to keep to the same script. Andrew had been robbed and beaten elsewhere. Their version sounded thin, and investigators were not convinced. The post-mortem results removed any doubt. Andrew's injuries were so extensive that 6 specialists, including burn experts and trauma surgeons, spent several days completing the examination. The pathologist and team first noted extreme emaciation, then a catalog of injuries that told a story of long-term abuse, including the tic-tac-toe pattern carved into his back. The post-mortem recorded roughly 150 wounds of differing severity, 21 fractured ribs, burns to the feet, neck, and back, lash marks, deep bruising, a skull fracture, and brain trauma, more typical of car crashes or significant falls. At the house, investigators applied luminol to reveal hidden blood. Stains appeared in many places, despite an obvious effort to scrub the scene. The findings made one conclusion unavoidable. Andrew Gardner had not been attacked by strangers. He had been tortured and ultimately killed by those inside the home. Claire Nichols, her brother, Simon Nichols, and her partner, Stephen Martin. Meanwhile, Andrew's mother had spent months trying to reach him with no success. His parents did not even know he had moved to another town with Claire, nor that a granddaughter had been born. On the 14th of March, 2009, when Gan and Ken Gardner heard a brief report that a 5-year-old man had been killed in a Chilton home, they did not think twice. It never occurred to them that the victim could be their son. The next day, detectives arrived and delivered the news no parent expects. The full scale of Andrew's ordeal emerged later in court, where pathologists and specialists described, in exacting detail, how each injury had been inflicted. Officers later acknowledged the case was unusually hard to process because of the sheer brutality involved among the worst many had seen. What stunned investigators most was that the driving force behind the abuse was a young mother of 4. From the start, Claire, Stephen, and Simon denied any role. They kept insisting they were innocent, offering the same story of strangers and a street attack. When it became clear that no one believed them, and that the forensic evidence contradicted every claim the trio turned on one another, each tried to shift blame elsewhere, pointing to the others as the true instigator. Their collapsing accounts only underscored what the evidence already showed. The violence had been orchestrated inside that house, and Andrew Gardner had paid the price. At one point, proceedings had to be halted. While testifying, Simon Nichols stated that Claire delivered the final blow that ended Andrew's life. Hearing her brother's accusation, Claire sprang from her seat and tried to attack him. Her fury spilled over in full view of the jury and the gallery, and court bailiffs restrained her as the judge briefly adjourned. Throughout the trial, none of the defendants expressed remorse. By contrast, jurors in the Crown Court were moved to tears when a video was played of Claire's 7-year-old son describing what had happened to his stepfather. He said his mother caught and pushed him because he stole a chocolate bar, adding that Andrew often stole food, and that the children joined in, he admitted, scratching Andrew with keys, hitting him with his fist, and even writing a slur on Andrew's back with a pen and nail polish. The boy believed Andrew had been sent to prison for nearly destroying their family. He did not know Andrew had died. Hearing such words from a 7-year-old was deeply unsettling. It underscored a grim reality. The children were not only witnesses to the violence inside that home, but had been drawn into it as participants. By the close of the trial, the jury was certain all 3 stood guilty. One of Claire Nichols's former partners even wept when she was led away, saying the thought that he might have suffered Andrew Gardner's fate still gave him chills. Years after their relationship, he reported persistent nightmares. "She beat me throughout our time together 4 or 5 times a week," he recounted. For Andrew Gardner's murder, 2 8-year-old Claire Nichols received life imprisonment with a minimum term of 32 years. Her brother, 2 4-year-old Simon Nichols, was also given life, with a 25-year minimum. Claire's partner, 4 4-year-old Stephen Martin, received life with a 20-year minimum. Only after serving those minimum terms may they seek parole. All 3 appealed, arguing the minimum terms were excessive. The Court of Appeal in London rejected the challenge, holding that the original sentences were fully warranted by the cruelty and gravity of the crimes. Andrew Gardner was remembered as gentle, affectionate, and open-hearted, a man who trusted others and would do almost anything to help someone he loved. Because of his nature, Andrew was exceptionally vulnerable, and those around him took advantage of that. Even in the worst moments, he remained gentle with Claire's 3 children despite their actions. For his infant daughter, he accepted hunger, injuries, and humiliation. He wanted only to stay close and watch her grow. That chance was stolen when his life ended at 35. The tragedy reached beyond Andrew. 4 children were harmed. They were raised in a home where abuse was normalized and encouraged, and 3 were ultimately left without parents. At the time of the trial, the oldest was 10. They knew of their father, John Peterson, but he was already in prison for an offense involving a 5-year-old girl. In that sense, these children suffered twice, first under their mother's influence, and then without stable parental care. Andrew's and Claire's baby daughter faced another burden. Because of her mother's actions, part of her early childhood unfolded within a prison environment. More painful still, she must grow up without a loving father, the very person her mother helped take from her. 16 years after the killing, all 3 perpetrators, Claire, Stephen, and Simon, remain incarcerated. Inside, Claire is said to have befriended Rose West, who ran a cross-stitch group, a detail that underscores how far removed prison life is from the world that Andrew hoped to share with his child. Rosemary Pauline West is a British serial killer who, with her husband Fred West, tortured and murdered at least 9 young women, as well as her 8-year-old stepdaughter. She received a whole life sentence with no possibility of parole. News that Claire Nichols befriended Rose West in prison raised obvious concerns. 2 offenders known for cruelty likely found common ground. Motive, however, was never fully explained. Authorities could not say what, in the decisive moments, drove Claire, Simon, and Stephen to slowly take the life of someone who lived beside them. Claire's pattern control, manipulation, and deliberate cruelty was well documented. The unanswered questions surrounded the others. Why Stephen, who had once been in Andrew's and even Simon's position, joined in? And why Simon, who feared his sister, participated rather than seek help? Whether intimidation, dependency, or a warped loyalty kept them silent remains unclear. If you read to the end, you likely appreciate careful true crime reporting. For more cases told clearly and responsibly, consider subscribing, enabling notifications, and leaving a comment.